Hello guys, this is Gameplays, I'm Fabio Pisco and welcome to my channel. NANI? Over a year ago I made a video of 10 tips to actually fix AMD's problems. And now over 1 year after, so one year after the previous video, so it's kind of over 1 year, it can be below 1 year, that doesn't really matter. What matters is that I'm now actually remaking that video that you see passing right now on the screen, but now with 14 tips instead of the 10 tips. And of course, this video will be hell of a cool. And you know what's also cool? Yeah, the sponsor of today's video. Today's video sponsor is GGG, where using my SKG discount code leads to a 25% off across several products, making a Windows 10 serial key only $16. After the payment, you'll receive the key in your account and all you need to do is to introduce it in your Windows settings and bam! You have an activated system. Just before going into the tips, let me tell you that this is more driven or made towards the AMD's problems, but this also works for Intel and Nvidia systems as well. Actually, most of them do. So if you have problems on your Nvidia or Intel system as well, you can use this video info to try and correct them. So let's go to the first tip. The first one is a clean driver installation. In this case, GPU driver installation. This is one of the most common issues, or at least one of the most common problems that lead to issues. Problems that what I meant is that this is one of the most common causes of the issues that most people have, okay? It will leave things on Windows that may actually cause your system to have problems, your Windows installation to have problems due to leaving things of the past drivers on the new drivers. Even more if you update from, let's say, you're using AMD drivers. If you update from the 22.5.1 drivers, which are drivers from like May, and you go and update to the newest AMD ones, which are drivers from November, you may actually have problems because you're updating from an older version, a really old version, and kind of overwriting the newer drivers on the previous drivers since they're so old. That can actually may cause issues, Windows and driver related. And for that, you do a clean GPU driver installation. How can you do it? Well, you can use DDU, which is Display Driver Uninstaller, for both Nvidia, Intel and AMD cards as well. So use Display Driver Uninstaller. You can also use for the AMD, you can use the AMD Cleanup utility that you can download on the AMD's website. And if you don't want to use any kind of utility, you can also just, when installing the driver, select the option of Factory Reset. And that will actually do a clean installation of your drivers or drivers plus software kit. And that alone will make a huge difference in terms of stability and sometimes even performance. Being able to fix black screens, blue screens, stuttering, amongst other issues. The second one is chipset drivers, and it kind of annoys me that most people don't even know what the chipset is. Chipset drivers are your motherboard drivers, okay? If you look at the chipset closely, it looks like a CPU that you have on your motherboard. Basically, the computational unit that controls all your motherboard things like inputs, outputs, and so on. That's what it does, more or less, okay? If you do not have your chipset drivers, even more on the AMD side, you may have issues like black screens, blue screens, even issues like FreeSync not working properly. Yes, chipset drivers, not having the chipset drivers or having really old chipset drivers or badly installed chipset drivers may cause your system to hang, may cause stutters, and may cause even things like unstable FreeSync, where you can actually see the tearing in the bottom of the screen, okay? That may be caused by not having the chipset drivers or having older versions of them. Now, what can you do? For the AMD side, it is quite simple. You just go to AMD website, you select the drivers menu, you go there, then you select your motherboard socket. So if you have a Ryzen from the 1000 to the 5000 series, you select the AM4 motherboards. If you actually have a Ryzen 7000 series, you select AM5. Over that, you select the chipset your motherboard is, for example, B550, B450, X670 or 570, 570, AM4, 670, AM5. Then you just go there and download the chipset drivers, easy as it can be, as easy as it can be. And all you have to do is run the installer, install the chipset drivers, and reboot your system, and you're good to go. And like I told you before, chipset drivers may fix a lot of issues because they actually include drivers like the GPU input-output, promontory drivers, Nvme drivers, lots of things that are really important on a system. And since AMD hardware is kind of picky in terms of drivers, you should always have chipset drivers installed. Okay, these ones are for your motherboard and for your CPU. So, but it's the motherboard that connects the GPU to the CPU and RAM and so on. So it's very important, once again, to have chipset drivers installed. And the third one is to update your motherboard BIOS, which is basically your motherboard software, your firmware, okay? It's basically what it is. And if you're having issues, it is very important to update your motherboard BIOS, because some people, for example, having issues with smart access memory. They have stutters with smart access memory activated, they have stutters, they have black screens and so on using smart access memory or resizable bar, for example. And that most of times is due to not having an updated motherboard BIOS. So you just go there to your motherboard's website. You can actually search on Google if you want to. Imagine that you have, for example, a B450 Tomahawk. Just go to the Google, search B450 Tomahawk BIOS, go to the MSI website, okay, go to the BIOS part, download the BIOS part, and well, if you want to actually know how to install the BIOS, you have this video that I made. But it is actually pretty simple. Most motherboards will allow you to actually search for your hard drives on your BIOS. MSI motherboards usually require a pen drive, so you just unzip or extract the file of your BIOS, put it on your pen drive, put the pen drive on your computer, run your BIOS, and then go to the easy update BIOS. It's really simple actually. It's a pretty simple process, but once again, you can watch this video if you want to see it step by step. But overall, very important, as it upgrades your CPU microcode, which also improves performance, stability, and so on most of the times. Even memory stability, memory overclockability, in between other things. So it is very important if you're having issues to update your motherboard BIOS. AMD has two types of drivers. You have the Adrenaline ones and you have the Pro ones. The Adrenaline ones are more gaming driven, they're focused on the gaming performance, while the professional drivers are exactly that. So they're focused mostly on the professional side of things. And the Pro drivers are way more tested in terms of stability, in terms of smoothness, exactly because of that. Because people working every day, every single day, 24/7, some of them with their computers in terms of professional workloads, they can't afford having black screens, blue screens, stutters, and all other things that some people do have. So if you're having problems with the Adrenaline drivers, you can still try these drivers, these Pro drivers, and don't worry, because you can actually use the Pro drivers in any GPU that you want. You can even go to the RX 570 or RX 580 and use the Pro drivers, no issues at all. You have an RX 5000 series, 6000 series, no issues at all. Go install the Pro drivers and they will work automatically. So it doesn't bring most of the newest or recent features, but it does bring way better smoothness and overall way better stability. As for the Amernime modded drivers, well, the Amernime drivers are an in-between the Adrenaline drivers and the Pro drivers, because I do believe that the Pro drivers are way more stable and maybe smoother than the Amernime modded drivers, because the Amernime modded drivers are just modded by a team, or a team of one. I don't really know if it is just one person or not, but they're modded, okay? But in some scenarios, they do bring better results than the usual Adrenaline drivers, because they unlock features that the Adrenaline drivers don't. So imagine if you have an APU, if you have an older GPU, or even if you have, let's say, if you have a laptop, okay, the Amernime modded drivers can unlock the AMD recording feature. While you don't have it on the Adrenaline drivers, the Amernime modded ones can actually unlock that feature. And the same happens, for example, for the DX11 optimizations. The X11 optimizations from AMD came for the RX 6000 series after the 22.5.2 drivers, but they did not come to the 5000 series yet, at least officially. But when using the Amernime modded drivers, even the older ones, you can have the DX11 optimizations on the RX 5000 series. And in some games, like for example God of War and others, it does make the difference. So if you want more performance and if you want overall better stability in older APIs like the X9, the X11 and so on, Amernime modded drivers are the way to go. If the Amernime modded drivers do not work well for you, you can also try the Pro drivers, which will bring you way better stability and once again, supposedly a better overall experience. The fifth one is still on the software side, and it is basically installing MS Afterburner and disabling the ULPS mode. ULPS, I do believe ULPS is ultra low power state or ultra low power saving, it's something like that. This is solely for the AMD cards, okay, because they have several power states and they will kind of decrease to really low power states when your GPU is kind of idling or when you're watching just some videos on YouTube, for example. And that may lead, those lower power states may lead, for example, to intermittent black screens, may lead to stutters in some games if the GPU BIOS isn't working properly, okay? Because you can actually be playing a game and you may have issues like for example frequencies dropping a lot even when you're not running into a CPU bottleneck and some things like that, and that may happen due to your GPU BIOS not being that great and going into the ultra low power state or ultra low power saving mode when playing games or when watching videos or so on, and that leads to intermittent black screens, intermittent stutters, overall stuttering and so on. So by installing MSI Afterburner and disabling the ultra low power state mode, ULPS doesn't really matter, and then rebooting your computer may actually solve these issues that I just talked about. So it is very important if you have an AMD card and if you're having problems to disable ULPS. Now this one is really interesting, and it is the VRAM temperatures. Overall, you should be watching your GPU temperatures from time to time when playing, and for that you can use the previous software that I talked about as well, the MSI Afterburner. Now for the VRAM temperatures, I do believe the MS Afterburner can be configured to show the VRAM temperatures as well, but you can simply manage them or at least watch them when using WAGinfo64, which is the software that I actually advise you. But what exactly can the high VRAM temperatures cause? Well, they can cause several things, but one of the most annoying ones that I've experienced with the previous GPU that I had, the RX 470 from Asus Strix, one of the first GPUs that I have since I actually created the channel in 2017, was that due to high VRAM temperatures, the GPU was throttling. Okay, and even though the temperatures of the core were fine, completely fine, like let's say 70 degrees, sometimes even less, 65, due to the high VRAM temperatures, the GPU would throttle to 300 MHz instead of the usual 1400. It would go like from 5 to 5 seconds, it would go down to 300 MHz for 1 or 2 seconds, and then it would go up back again. This would cause massive stutters, massive FPS drop, and at the time I didn't actually know what it was, but now I know. It was the VRAM temperature, and it was actually causing that bad, really bad throttling. But what can you actually do to fix it per se? The first thing that you can actually do is to ramp up your fan RPM. Basically, if you're running your fans at 60%, even though your GPU core temperature is fine, your VRAM temperature isn't. So what you have to do is go from, let's say, 60% to 70 or 80% to maintain those VRAM temperatures at least below 100 degrees, because it may sound like a jet engine, but it may actually fix your issue. But if you don't want that, you can also change the VRAM thermal pads on your GPU. You do have to open the GPU, so if you have warranty in some cases, not all countries, but in some countries the warranty will be voided. But if you still don't have, or if you don't have the warranty anymore, you can just open the GPU, you can change the thermal pads, you can buy some on eBay, Amazon and so on, change them, put new thermal pads on your GPU, and that will most likely fix the issue. Because the VRAM overheating is not a common issue, but it does happen mostly on lower end GPU models, where they actually cheap out on thermal pads and other components. So ramp up your fan RPMs or change your thermal pads on the VRAM. If you don't know how to do it, just take your card to someone who does, in order to not actually break it. Or just watch some tutorials. I mean, do what you wish, but it will most likely fix your issue if this is the cause. The seventh one is GPU reset. And I know this might sound crazy or might sound a little bit dumb, but it actually isn't. I saw lots of people having problems before with stutters, black screens, sometimes the computer even shutting down, and that was because they had the GPU badly seated. So it wasn't fully connected with the motherboard. It would still display image, it would still play, but it would have lots of issues, black screens, blue screens, sometimes the computer just powering down, stutters, in between many other things, and yeah, the GPU was not well seated. Also, it may have, for example, a short circuit, or it may even have some dust on the connectors of the GPU that may be fixed by just reseating the GPU. So just take the GPU off, reseat the GPU once again, and it may actually fix your issues. Seeming dumber or not, it may. Yeah. Now we have display cables and display connections. Having bad display cables or bad display connections can usually lead to black screens or intermittent black screens, gray screens, green screens, sometimes even stutters on the monitor side, and that all because of a poor display cable or a poor display connection. The first thing I advise you to do is to try your current cable and just change the display connection. Okay, if you have, for example, 2 or 3 DisplayPort connections, just change in between them to see if the issue is fixed. Now, if you have, for example, a spare HDMI or a spare DisplayPort, imagine that you're using HDMI and your GPU and monitor actually support DisplayPort. So try changing HDMI to DisplayPort, as it may also fix the issue. But let's just imagine that your monitor just supports HDMI and does not have a DisplayPort entrance. Then just get a new cable and please don't buy those cheap cables. That annoys the hell out of me. Don't buy cheap cables. Get a decent HDMI cable, gold plated if you can, that supports high resolution at high frequency. And if you can, a thick cable, a decently thick cable, that's what she said once again, because those are usually better than the slimmer ones, than the smaller ones. So just get a decent HDMI cable, and that once again may fix your issue with intermittent black screens, with some stutters, green screens, and even gray screens, okay? That's a tip. Still on the monitor side, we have monitor's firmware. What is the monitor's firmware? The monitor's firmware is basically your monitor's software, okay? It's the inbuilt software that controls, for example, if you have FreeSync or G-Sync, the software that controls the monitor, how it displays the image, how it displays FreeSync. And if you have your monitor, for example, if you bought your monitor when it came out, several years ago, well, it is possible that you have the first or one of the first firmware versions of the monitor, and some of those first versions of the monitor's firmware may not work properly. What I advise you is to go to the monitor's website, go to the model, go to the support part and see if they have a firmware update. If they have a firmware update, download it and install it, because it may fix indeed, once again, gray screen problems, green screen problems, and in between other problems, even black screens, okay? Go to the manufacturer's website, download the firmware if available, the firmware update, and install it. And that's it. Now the 10th one is aimed at AMD GPUs only, and it is disable Radeon Anti-Lag and enable FreeSync. Why am I telling you this and why is this important? Because you may actually feel the stutters, but the stutters may not be happening on the GPU side. Wanna check it out? Basically use the software that we talked about before, MS Afterburner with a Riva statistics server, run into a game and see if you have kind of a flat line on your gaming. So enable the frame timing line, okay, and see if the frame timeline is stable. If the frame timeline is minimally stable without any big spikes, then it means that your GPU is actually performing fine and the stutters are not on the game side or on the GPU side. It means that the stutters that you're feeling or the choppiness that you're feeling is actually on the monitor side. Once again, if the line has no spikes, no visible spikes, it means that the stutters are on the monitor side. How can you actually find out what's causing it? Well, usually one of the features on the AMD software kit may actually cause it, and it is called Radeon Anti-Lag. So if you have Radeon Anti-Lag enabled and you're seeing exactly this same situation that I'm telling you right now, disable the Radeon Anti-Lag. And if you have FreeSync and do not have FreeSync enabled, enable it right away. Want to know more about FreeSync and how it works and the benefits and the downsides of FreeSync, or even versus G-Sync? Well, watch this video passing right now on the screen with link in the description, because it's a very interesting video in my opinion. Now this one is very important, actually much more than most people think, which is checking your overclocking stability. You can have unstable RAM, you can have unstable CPUs, and you can have unstable GPUs, and even gaming for several hours straight with no issues. But when you go into that specific game that actually demands more of your GPU, of your CPU, or of your RAM configuration, you'll have crashes, you'll have problems. And then you'll think something like, I did the same mistake in the past. You'll think something like, okay, but it is stable in all games, why this game is having problems? Maybe this game has some issue. No. What has some issues is your overclocking. Basically, when overclocking RAM, I do advise you to use test memory 5 and do several runs like 2 or 3 hours if you want to go into the maximum stability with a minimum of 15 minutes, in my opinion, of course. So you should not have any errors, because if you have one error alone, it will actually say that you're not stable. As for GPU stability, I do advise you to actually test it on really heavy GPU games, because from my experience it is the best way to test it. If you use the inbuilt Radeon benchmark or stability benchmark, it isn't that great. It tells you most times that the system is stable while it is not. Even if using benchmarks like Heaven, like 3D Mark, well, those won't most of times show you your system, your GPU instability in this case. But when playing heavier games like, for example, Control, in some scenarios to test VRAM, Assassin's Creed Valhalla is a great game. So just go test your games, test really heavy games for your GPU, 1 hour let's say, and if they run flawlessly, then your system is most likely stable in terms of GPU. And in terms of CPU, it is the same. It is the same. You just go and test, for example, Prime 95 for, let's say, an hour, and if your system is stable for 1 hour in Prime 95, it is highly unlikely that it will ever, and I repeat, ever, reboot your system or have instability in other things like gaming, even rendering and so on. So that's my opinion in this particular fact. And if you're having problems, if you're having blue screens, if you're having black screens, if you're having your system shutting down out of the blue, just disable all your overclocks. And I mean it, like CPU overclock, RAM overclock, even if you're using XMP, okay, if you're using the normal RAM frequency and timings, just put it down to, let's say, if you're using DDR5 to 4800, if you're using DDR4 to 2133 MHz or 2400 MHz, just put it down on the BIOS and try again. And if that fixes the issues that you were having before, it means that you had an overclocking instability. So before you start pointing fingers, check your overclocking stability. Getting closer to the final line, we have disable virtualization or core isolation. If you want to use, for example, a VirtualBox, virtualization is needed. Now, if you don't need virtualization for anything else, if you don't really need it, if you don't use it, if you just game and do some applications, some render, some compressing, decompressing, well, just go to your BIOS. That's my opinion, of course. That's my advice. Go to your BIOS, usually on the advanced settings, on the advanced CPU settings, and disable the Hyper-V or the hardware virtualization. Now, if you use it for certain applications like VirtualBoxes, for example, and you actually need it enabled, just leave it enabled on the BIOS and go to the search bar on Windows and search for core isolation. Just go to the setting and disable it. As you can see in this video passing right now in the screen, I tested it on the 7700X, which is a very powerful CPU, and even then when going into the Spider-Man Remastered, I can actually see a performance uplift when disabling the core isolation. It means that the core isolation was actually using resources that were needed in the game, CPU resources, and I was having way lower FPS with it enabled. So if you need virtualization, but you still want to game properly and you don't want any other thing messing with it, disable the core isolation. Power supplies. Who doesn't have one? Everyone has a power supply. Now, some people have real power supplies and other people have time bombs. They have something there that it isn't actually a power supply and it is there just waiting to explode and fuck up your whole computer. What I advise people when buying a computer or when upgrading is do not cheap out on power supplies. Never. A power supply will last you a decade. I actually have a power supply completely working here, giving zero issues. It has over 10 years and it is still performing almost as it was new, okay? Because the PSU was actually good. It was a good PSU with good components, good capacitors, good power rails and so on, and that's why after several years it is still working perfectly. Get at least something from a known brand like Corsair, Cooler Master, and something like 650 watts Seasonic, for example. There are more, but anyway, minimum of bronze certification with 650 watts plus. That's what I advise. If you can spend the money, at least 750 watts gold, because like I told you, a good power supply will last you for over 10 years. It is worth the money spent, and it will ensure that you won't have problems when it comes to power supplying and some things like that, okay? It's a major thing to do. Do not cheap out on the PSU. So even if your PSU seems to have enough power for your computer, okay, the power rails may not be enough for the power picks, or the power rails may have low quality, and that may lead to the power not being fed correctly to the GPU. And that will mean that the GPU won't work as it should work, and that may mean to you black screens, blue screens, stutters, in between many other things. So get a good PSU from a good brand to not have these kind of issues and to not even care about changing PSU in more than 10 years. That's my opinion. The 14th one and almost the final one is also an obvious one, changing your HDD to an SSD. And yes, you may have a NASA computer, but if you put a game inside your HDD and actually run it from the HDD in your NASA computer, it will still stutter. And that's because the hard drive won't be fast enough to feed enough data to the other components, in this case to the CPU, to the RAM, then the GPU, and that will cause stutters. If you want to watch more, I have this video of HDD versus SSD, and you'll actually see side by side that games like Horizon Zero Dawn, games like Call of Duty Warzone stutter a lot, not just a little, a lot in most parts when using the hard drive, even with a very, very good system. When using the SSD, it will be smooth as hell. And the last one is basically a clean Windows installation. And yes, once again, it may seem obvious, but in some cases, well, most people won't know that that's the problem. You may have virus, you may have a corrupted Windows installation, you may have lots of software actually conflicting with your games and causing you several problems. So if all the other things before failed, just do a clean Windows installation, because that may fix your issue. And well guys, that's all for today's video. Hope this video really helped you. Don't forget to like, subscribe and share this video, and leave your comment in the comment section if this video helped you in some way, or if you need more help besides this video. Thanks a lot for watching, and see you in the next one.